In this video, I'm going to show you how to use geometry nodes. I'll do so by creating this mushroom generator. So let's start with creating the stem. For that, add in any random object, go to the geometry nodes workspace and create a new node setup. Now you can see this adds a geometry nodes modifier with our current node setup selected in it. Within the node setup, we see this group input and group output node. The group input by default will only have a geometry output, which is the base geometry we started with. So in this case, a cube. The group output also only has one geometry input, and that's where we plug in what we want to output. You can add more, but I won't be getting into that in this video. Okay, that's for the very basics. Now for the mushroom. Let's start with the stem. So we have multiple options with what we can start with. We can either add in a cylinder, which in geometry nodes we can just add in all the basic primitives you would have in our regular add dropdown. But I think going this route will make it a little bit harder to achieve the shape we want. So instead, I want to start with a curve line node and set the endpoint to the height we want the mushroom to be. Now when we plug this into the group output, we can see our curve line. Now to add thickness, we have to convert this curve to a mesh. So to do that, add a curve to mesh node. Now we can see that in this window up here, the count under spline went from 1 to 0 and the vertex count went from 0 to 2. So we have converted it to a mesh, but we still don't have any thickness. And this is because we need to supply the curve to mesh node with a profile curve, which in this case, we want the profile to be just a circle. So add a curve circle node and connect it to the profile curve. Now the curve has some thickness, but it's obviously way too big. So you could decrease the radius in the curve circle node, but what I prefer is to use a set curve radius node on the original curve line. And now we can set the radius in here. We also want the top and bottom to be closed, so check the fill caps checkbox in the curve to mesh node as well. Effectively, we have just made a cylinder. So the reason why I wanted to create it this way instead of just using a cylinder is because of this next step, which is to vary the thickness of the stem based on the position that we are along the curve. We can do this by first adding a spline parameter node, which gives us 3 outputs. We only care about the factor and length though. The factor always gives you a gradient that stretches from 0 to 1 along the curve, no matter if it's 20 centimeters high or 200 meters high. And the length gives you a gradient from 0 to the total height of the curve, which might be 1 or might be 100. So for our use case, we want to use the factor. And maybe you already have an idea what we're going to do next, which is to plug the factor into the set curve radius input, which results in this. Now, if we want to shape this, you can add a RGB curves node and tweak the shape in this node to the shape we want. And you'll see the shape doesn't conform to it. And the reason is a lack of resolution. So add a resample curve node and set the count to the number of divisions you want. And you can see now it follows the shape we set in here. So before we actually start playing around with the shape, we have to do something about the fact that it's way too thick again, which is to add a math node, set it to multiply and multiply it by a value that gives us the thickness we're after. And now we can finally tweak the curve to give us the shape we want. I'm pretty happy with the shape and we will come back to the stem later, but for now, let's move on to the cap. So again, we want to start by adding the base for our cap, which for us will just be a mesh circle. Now, in the mesh circle node, reduce the radius to the radius of a mushroom cap and reduce the resolution to 16. The reason is because we'll be subdividing this shape later and I don't want it to get too heavy. We also need this to have fill, so set the fill type to triangles. And then we'll do what I mentioned earlier, which is to add a subdivision surface node and crank the level up a bit. Now we have the problem that the cap is at the 0, 0, 0 position, but we need it to be at the top of our stem. Luckily, we have this end position here, which is where the curve line ends. And incidentally, this is exactly where we want to have the cap. So if we just add a combine XYZ node, copy our end position into that combine XYZ node and plug it into the end, nothing will change for the stem, but we will be able to use this for the position of the cap as well, without having to set the height of the mushroom in 2 separate places. But again, how do we push the cap up to that position? Well, using a set position node. So add one in and plug the output of the combine XYZ node into the offset. And now if you want to see the start of the cap and the stem at the same time, we'll have to join them together, which we can do using a join geometry node, which will plug both the stem and the cap into. Now to add that curve to the cap, we'll be using another set position node. And for the offset, we'll need some sort of gradient that goes from the inside of the cap to the outside of the cap, which we can create using a position node, which is just the X, Y, and Z position within the mesh, and feed it through a vector math node set to length, which right now doesn't have the best gradient for 2 reasons. First, the gradient starts at the very center of our object and we are about 25 centimeters up. And the second one being that our cap only has a 60 centimeter diameter as well. So our gradient makes us out at, I think, about 0.3. So to fix that, we'll first have to eliminate the z-axis from our vector, which we can do by adding a separate XYZ node, as well as a combine XYZ node, and connecting everything except the z-axis. And now this has already made the gradient a lot more noticeable. Now to fix the second problem, just add a map range node and copy the radius over into the from max slot. Now, if you want to be able to tweak this radius later down the line without having to copy it into all these different inputs, just add a value node, set it to 0.3 and plug it into the radius of the mesh circle, as well as the from max input of the map range node. And now you can tweak the radius and the gradient will follow. And now we can use this gradient to push down the edges of the cap. So to do that, we want to plug the result of the map range node into the offset of the set position node we added earlier. But we only wanted to affect the z-axis because we only wanted to be pushed up and down. But the offset input doesn't let us do that. So to be able to anyway, we'll have to again add a combine XYZ node, plug it into the offset, and then plug our result into the z-axis. And we can see it gets stretched into the completely wrong direction. We can fix this using two ways, but the one I'll do is to add a mix node, leave the a at 0 and set the b to something like minus 0.2. We can see the very center does get affected a little bit, so we can change the a to something a little bit above 0. And now this is going into the right direction, but we again want to tweak the shape to be more in line with what we have in mind. So again, we can do this by adding an RGB curves node between the map range and the mix node and just tweaking it until we have something that we're happy with. We can also change the radius to fit the mushroom we have in mind a bit more. You'll also notice that this curve is inverted, and if you find that annoying, you can go to the map range node and flip the to min value to 1 and the to max value to 0, as well as swapping the a and b values in the mix node. And now you can go back to the regular tweaking. Now, once you have a shape you're happy with, we can move on to giving the cap some thickness. And the way to do this is to add an extrude mesh node, uncheck individual, and decrease the offset to something a bit more reasonable. The problem is that the caps of mushrooms are thinner at the bottom edges compared to the tops of the caps. And the way we can do this is by again using the output of this whole gradient thing we did earlier and plugging it into the offset scale. Of course, this makes the whole mushroom way too big, so we can either multiply it by some value to reduce it, or what I prefer is to add a mix node and tweak the a and b values until we have something we like. And this gives you a little bit more flexibility. If you look carefully, you'll see that the extrude mesh removed the inner faces of our cap. So to get them back, add another join geometry node and join the output of the extrude mesh node with the original mesh. This still has the problem that these are two separate meshes, but we can join them together using a merge by distance node. And the cool thing about geometry nodes is that now if you realize, oh, I actually don't like the shape of the cap, you can just go back to the RGB curves node, which is responsible for the shape of the cap, and continue tweaking it without having to redo anything down the line. Now again, we will come back to this cap, but for now, let's distribute some white dots on top of it. To do that, add a distribute points on faces node and plug our cap into the mesh. Now we can see these two huge points spawned on top of the cap. If you want more, just increase the density. But now we can see the points clip into each other. If you don't want that, switch this dropdown from random to Poisson disk. Again, increase the density, but now increase the distance minimum as well. And this will ensure a minimum distance between each of the points. To add our points, we want to add an instance on points node, and as the instance, use an icosphere with the subdivision set to 2. These are way too big, so you can either decrease the radius here or the scale in the instance on points node. Again, if we want to view this together with the rest of the mushroom, you can plug the result into our join geometry. Now for some randomization of these points, we can add a random value node, which will give us a random value for each instance and set the min and max to the minimum and maximum sizes we want our dots to be. Now, these dots are sticking out a bit too much for my liking, so I want to squish them a little bit so that they're more disc shaped. So to do that, you can just add a scale elements node, switch this drop down from uniform to single axis, and set all the axes you want to scale on to 1. In our case, only the Z. Then finally, decrease the scale a bit. And now we have our desired disc shape. If we view the result though, we can see that our discs aren't aligned with the cap at all. And fixing this is very simple. We just take the rotation output of the distribute points on faces node and plug it into the rotation input of the instance on points node. And boom, they're aligned. Now they aren't random enough for me yet, so I want to displace all of them using a noise texture. But right now all our dots are still instances and we can't manipulate instances individually. So before we do anything else, we have to add a realize instances node, which will convert all of these instances into an actual mesh. And now now we can again add our set position node as well as a noise texture. And RGB and XYZ are basically synonymous in Blender, so we can use this effect by just plugging the color output into the offset, which will then just convert the colors red, green and blue to X, Y and Z. Now you can see that all our dots disappeared, and this is because the average value of a noise texture is 0.5, which pushes all the dots away by 0.5. So we just have to add another vector math node, set it to subtract and type in 0.5 in the X, Y and Z. Still, it's a bit much displacement, so we can again duplicate the vector math node, this time set it to scale, maybe set it to 0 for now, and increase it until we have a good amount of displacement. They're still shifting around as a whole, and the reason for this is just that the scale of the noise texture is way too big, so I increased the scale enough. Now we're starting to get the effect I am after. For my liking, these aren't enough dots, so I can just increase the density max and decrease the distance minimum to add a whole bunch more dots. What we just did there with the noise texture is we randomized the dots, which I still want to do to the entire rest of the mushroom as well. The first thing I want to do is to vary the tilt of the stem. Now, your instinct would be to vary the end position. The problem with this is that we then would have to vary the position of the cap as well, which I don't want to deal with. So instead, let's just vary the start position. To do that, we can just add another random value node, set this dropdown here to vector, and set our desired minimum and maximum start position. I don't want it to affect the Z, so we'll want to set the maximum Z to 0, and the minimum X and Y I'm going to set to something like 0.02 and the maximum to 0.02. And if you try to plug this into the start, you'll see this doesn't work. I don't know why. I think it should work, but it doesn't. So instead, what we can just do is to add another set position node, plug our random value output vector into the offset, and to restrict the sliding around to only the bottom of the stem, add another vector math node set to scale, and plug the vector output from this plane parameter node into the scale. And this restricts the movement to only the top of the stem. So we'll need to flip it to give us our desired effect. To do this, add a mix node, plug the vector into vector, and set the A to 1 and the B to 0. And now the effect is restricted to the bottom of the stem. Maybe this isn't enough randomness though, so why not add a little bit more? Now for some more randomness, we can again displace the stem using a set position node and noise texture. Now onto the cap. For it, I first of all want to do the exact same thing with the noise texture and set position node, but additionally I want to add some more randomness to the very bottom of the cap, because the main thing I want to do is to break up this bottom edge a bit more and make it a lot more random. To do that, I'll duplicate this entire noise texture set position node setup, plug the cap into the geometry and swap the output. Then I'll decrease the scale a little bit. And the randomness of the edge I want is a bit like this, but the top I don't want to affect that much because that looks like terrible. The way we can do this is to once again use our trusty normalized length and plug it into the scale. Now this is again inverted, so we'll have to add another mix node, plug this into the vector, set the A to 1, the B to 0, and actually decrease the A because that's still a bit too much. I might also add a color ramp because I don't like the distribution of this effect. Decrease the effect a little bit, and I'm happy with that. And now we can just duplicate the noise texture setup one more time and add it back on the cap in a little bit of a weaker state. Now I want to shade the smooth, but we'll see this doesn't work. So you'll have to add a set shade smooth node at the end of our node setup. Two more things. The first one being how to connect group inputs to make this a lot more tweakable from the outside of the node group. And the second being some general material tips. I won't get into how I made the materials because this isn't a video about shader nodes, but if you want a separate video like this about shader nodes, let me know. But anyway, as for the inputs, of course we want a seed input to be able to quickly create a lot of variations of this mushroom. So to start, find some node that has a seed and plug it into this gray socket here, which will create a new input, which will also show up in the modifier here. And now just take this seed and plug it into all the random value nodes, as well as the distribute points on faces node. Now if you tweak this, we can see that it does change, but the noise pattern on the stem and the cap doesn't change. And to fix that, I am gonna switch all noise textures to 4D, multiply our seed by something like 100, because when changing the W value, small changes won't have a large enough effect to meaningfully change the noise texture. And then plug that result of the multiply node into all the W values of the 4D noise textures. Now if we change the seed, the mushroom changes a whole lot. But what if we want to make a taller mushroom, shorter mushroom, wider mushroom, whatever the case may be? Well, for that, we can connect the Z input of our combine XYZ node to the group input as well, which will be the height. We can also rename these inputs inputs to whatever we want by pressing N, going to group sockets, and then renaming the socket. If we also want to control the radius, we can replace this value node with a group input, radius. Now we can change the radius. Oh my god. Maybe we have a tiny little mushroom like this, you know, you can experiment with this. If you want to add a default value, you can also set that in here, in this group sockets dropdown. All right, now for material tips. If you were to create a material right now and make it red, you will see it does not affect the mushroom. And this is because you have to assign the materials to the parts of the mesh you wanted to affect. And you can do this by adding a set material node and selecting the material you want. If you want to transfer some attribute you only have in Geometry Node to the material nodes, you can do so by using a store named attribute node, adding the name here, gradient, and connecting whatever you want to store to the value input. Now, once you go to shader nodes, you can add an attribute node, type the name, and view the attribute. About attributes, another very important thing is the capture attribute node. Sometimes, let's just say you want to displace these dots along the normal of the cap. Okay, so your first instinct might be, let's just add a set position node. Okay, let's look for a normal node. Yep, we got a normal node and plug the normal into the offset. This is only the normal of the dots, but not the cap. So how do we displace these dots along the normal of the cap? Well, you use a capture attribute node on the cap before you distribute points on faces. Connect the normal node output into this gray socket, which will be the output you want to save. And the important thing is that you put it in the same chain where you want to read out the value later down the line. So connect this to the mesh of the distributed points on faces. And now use this normal output instead of requesting the normal again. And now you can see we're displacing along the normal of the cap. There are a lot of situations where this is going to be critical to get the effect you want. But that's it. I hope this video was helpful, and if it was, check out this video next and subscribe.